He was blasting them, photographing them, cut his genitalia. Do you know that? Did you know that?
Nothing about him lives up to all of the stories that we had been hearing.
The pictures weren't as fulfilling as actually having someone there.
And he would pose them in a particular fashion with their legs bent on their back and their hands behind their heads. He had 85 photos, 13 victims.
I desensitized myself to it. I don't know, I went to great lengths.
As Conversations with a K, the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes heads to Netflix following the streaming platform's contentious triumph with the scripted limited series Dahmer Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. Enthusiasts of true crime are eagerly seeking insights into the horrifying deeds of Jeffrey Dahmer. The infamous serial K faced 15 murder convictions for the slaying of 17 individuals, predominantly Black, Latino, and Asian men, spanning from 1978 to 91. This led to his imprisonment for a staggering 957 years. Jeffrey Dahmer met his demise at the Columbia Correctional Facility in Wisconsin in '94 when another inmate, Christopher Scarver, fatally beat him. Scarver, sentenced to life in prison in 1990 for shooting Stephen Lauman, a Wisconsin Conservation Corps employee, 3 times, experienced a mental unraveling. According to the tab, Scarver started hearing voices proclaiming him the chosen one, after being terminated from his job at the same company where Lauman worked. In a disturbing turn of events, Scarver, feeling slighted, demanded money from a site manager, receiving only $15, leading him to take the drastic step of K-ing Lauman.
Everybody played the fool this time.
On the other hand, Netflix's Monster has sparked diverse reactions from audiences worldwide. The series delves into the deeds of one of the most infamous modern serial killers, reigniting curiosity about Jeffrey Dahmer and the real-life individuals depicted in the show. Despite its gripping narrative, the release has stirred controversy, drawing criticism from the families of the victims who argue that it rekindles past traumas. However, there's also commendation for the show's emphasis on the victims' perspectives. Ryan Murphy, the creator, strategically omits certain details from Jeffrey Dahmer's past, aiming to avoid an excessive focus on the K's viewpoint and instead centering the narrative on the victims.
Hello, this is Glenda Cleveland. Can you send an officer to the Oxford apartment?
In the show, Christopher Scarver, portrayed by Furley Mack, infamously K's Dahmer in the unsupervised prison gym. This act elicited a range of responses from the public, with some hailing the murder as a form of justice, while others believe Dahmer should have served his sentence in prison. Regardless, Scarver found himself thrust into the public spotlight following the incident, shedding light on details of his own dark past. In addition to the murders of Jeffrey Dahmer and Stephen Lauman, Christopher Scarver also took the life of another inmate. Shortly after the K-ing of Dahmer, Scarver severely injured Jesse Anderson, who succumbed to his injuries days later. Despite these connections, Scarver's fatal attacks on both Dahmer and Anderson were not interpreted as racially motivated.
The Lord spoke to me, though. He asked me, punish you for all of them innocent lives you took and families you destroyed.
Upon the demise of Jeffrey Dahmer, Christopher Scarver unexpectedly rose as an unconventional figure hailed by some as a hero within the nation. The notorious fact remains that Scarver was responsible for beating Dahmer to death in a state prison. However, the details surrounding that fateful day and Scarver's current whereabouts raise intriguing questions. Is Christopher Scarver truly a chosen figure, or is there more to the story of his actions and their consequences? Christopher Scarver, a 54-year-old convicted murderer, gained widespread media attention for the K of his fellow inmates Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Born on July 6, 1969 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Scarver was the second of 5 siblings. His early life took a tumultuous turn when he dropped out of James Madison High School during the 11th grade. Facing challenges, Scarver found himself entangled with negative influences, leading to his expulsion from his mother's home due to his escalating alcohol and marijuana consumption. In an attempt to turn his life around, Scarver secured a position as a trainee carpenter through the Wisconsin Conservation Corps job program. However, a promise of a full-time job from his supervisor Edward Patz was shattered when Patz resigned, leaving Scarver disillusioned and unemployed. The setback marked the beginning of Scarver's descent into daily alcohol abuse and bitterness. Amidst the haze of alcohol, Scarver's experiences took an unusual turn. Rather than losing consciousness like most under the influence, he claimed to hear divine voices referring to him as the Chosen One. This peculiar manifestation led to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a mental disorder characterized by symptoms such as hearing voices, delusions, and disorganized thinking. While Christopher Scarver initially gained praise for the K of Jeffrey Dahmer, questions about the morality and righteousness of his actions have arisen over the years, shedding light on Scarver's own dark history as a terrifying convicted murderer.
Everybody played it before this time. No exception to the rule.
On June 1, 1990, Scarver ventured into the Wisconsin Conservation Corps training program office with the intent of committing robbery, encountering two individuals, site manager John Fayen and employee Steve Lawman. Scarver demanded money from Fayen, holding Lawman at gunpoint. Believing Scarver was bluffing, Fayen provided only $15, further infuriating Scarver. In a burst of rage, Scarver shot Lawman in the head, resulting in immediate death. In an attempt to appease Scarver, Fayen wrote a $3,000 check. As the terrorized Fayen fled to his car outside, Scarver fired at him, narrowly missing. This disturbing incident unfolded when Chris Scarver was just 21 years old, marking the beginning of his notorious criminal history. The details of this heinous act bring into question the narrative surrounding Scarver's later actions and prompt a deeper examination of his own capacity for violence and cruelty. However, this is what his son said.
When I was young, I didn't know what it meant, obviously, but, that name, it's been around me for my whole life.
In 1992, Scarver was imprisoned at the Columbia Correctional Institution, having been found guilty of murder and handed a life sentence. During his trial that year, Scarver asserted that he was the offspring of God and contended that he experienced auditory hallucinations. Jeffrey Dahmer, an American serial K, claimed the lives of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Over a span of more than 13 years, Dahmer targeted his victims, primarily black men, at locations such as gay bars, malls, and bus stops. Using promises of money or S, he lured them to his home where he provided them with alcohol spiked with drugs before strangling them. Following the murders, he engaged in disturbing acts with the corpses, including dismemberment and disposal, often retaining body parts as mementos. Dahmer documented his gruesome deeds by taking photographs at various stages of the process, allowing him to revisit and relive each horrifying act.
People that worked with him had no idea that he was a violent man. This was part of the real danger of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Jeffrey Dahmer came into the world in Milwaukee on May 21, 1960 as the son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. Initially characterized as an energetic and cheerful child, his demeanor took a turn around the age of 4 after undergoing a distressing recovery from surgery to correct a double hernia. This experience seemed to trigger a noticeable shift in his behavior, leading to increased withdrawal, particularly following the birth of his younger brother and the family's frequent relocations. By the time Dahmer reached school age, the family had settled in Ohio. From a young age, Dahmer developed a keen interest in animal bones, dedicating himself to studying their cleanliness and preservation techniques. As a child, he amassed collections of large insects and small animal skulls, meticulously preserving them in jars of formaldehyde, as detailed in Brian Masters' book, The Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer.
He found a road and he wanted to see what was inside it, like a raccoon or a dog. He brought that home. A dead dog that he found on the side of the road was hit by a car, cut that open, and looked at the insides of that.
By his early teens, Dahmer exhibited signs of disengagement, tension, and social isolation. While he later claimed that his inclinations towards necrophilia and murder surfaced around the age of 14, it appears that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their contentious divorce a few years later may have played a role in translating these thoughts into actions. The frequent arguments and perpetual tension within his household made Dahmer question the stability of his family life, contributing to the complex factors that influenced his later actions, as noted by Masters.
His mother had a mental problem. She was depressed most of the time. She slept a lot and dropped out of family activities. The father was a PhD chemist.
At the age of 14, Dahmer began his foray into alcohol consumption, and by the time he committed his first murder at 18, his drinking had spiraled out of control.
So what he did as a young man with animals, he eventually did do later on in life with human beings.
After a brief stint at Ohio State University where he dropped out after 1/4 term, Dahmer's recently remarried father insisted that he join the army. Dahmer enlisted in late December 1978 and was stationed in Germany shortly afterward. His issues with alcohol persisted, leading to his discharge from the army in early 1981. While German authorities later probed potential connections between Dahmer and local murders during that period, there is no indication that he claimed any victims during his military service. After his discharge from the army, Dahmer returned to his home in Ohio. An arrest in the same year for disorderly conduct led to his father sending him to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in Wisconsin. Despite the change in environment, Dahmer's struggle with alcohol persisted, and he faced another arrest the following summer, this time for indecent exposure. In 1986, he was once again arrested when 2 boys accused him of M in their presence, resulting in a 1-year probationary sentence.
Becoming aroused, and the cutting up of these animals somehow became enmeshed.
Dahmer perpetrated a series of 17 between 1978 and 91, displaying a meticulous approach to victim selection. He targeted individuals on the outskirts of society, often struggling or with borderline criminal backgrounds, to minimize the visibility of their disappearances and decrease the likelihood of capture. Employing promises of money or S, Dahmer lured his victims to his residence where he proceeded to strangle them to death. Engaging in horrifying post-mortem acts, he retained body parts and photographs as grisly mementos. The notorious nicknames attributed to him, such as the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster, attest to the extreme nature of his crimes. Dahmer's initial murder took place just after graduating from Revere High School in June 1978. His first victim was an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, whom he brought to his parents' house. After getting Hicks intoxicated, Dahmer prevented him from leaving, eventually K-ing him by striking him in the head and strangling him with a barbell. Dahmer proceeded to dismember Hicks' corpse, packing the body parts in plastic bags and burying them behind his parents' home. Later, he exhumed the remains, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them across the wooded ravine. In September 1987, Dahmer claimed his second victim, Stephen Tuomi. They checked into a hotel room, consumed alcohol, and Dahmer later awoke to discover Tuomi dead, with no recollection of the previous night's events. Dahmer informed the police that he had intended to drug Tuomi but not to K him, expressing disbelief at the outcome. Following the murder, Dahmer purchased a large suitcase to transport Tuomi's body to his grandmother's basement. There, he dismembered the corpse, engaged in disturbing acts, and disposed of the remains. He retained Tuomi's head, wrapped in a blanket for several weeks. Dahmer admitted that Tuomi's K marked the intensification of his obsession with K, and he made no attempt to restrain it thereafter. He went on to K 2 more victims at his grandmother's house before she compelled him to move out in 1988. Unaware of his crimes, she grew weary of his drinking, his habit of bringing young men to her home, and the occasional foul odors emanating from her basement, according to Masters. Dahmer's father, Lionel Dahmer, told Larry King Live that growing up, he assumed Jeffrey was a normal, if rather shy, young man, but that he now believed the adage, "Watch out for the quiet ones," is valid. The only red flag, Lionel recalled, that Jeffrey may not have been psychologically sound was his fixation with road K and harming animals. Quote, "If I had known about the road K, I would have done something immediately. Intervened," Lionel said, adding, "Don't disregard shyness. Things can be fermenting in that young mind. Dig. I wasn't tuned to that. In the 50s and 60s, especially with men, you weren't really taught to be a psychologist." In September 1989, approximately a year after settling into his new apartment, Dahmer enticed a 13-year-old Laotian boy to his residence under the guise of wanting to take nude photographs. This act led to charges of SE and second-degree SA against Dahmer. He entered a guilty plea, asserting that the boy had appeared much older than his actual age. While awaiting sentencing for the SA case, Dahmer continued his gruesome activities in his grandmother's basement. In March 1989, he lured, drugged, strangled, sodomized, photographed, dismembered, and disposed of Anthony Sears, an aspiring model. Dahmer was particularly captivated by Sears and expressed a reluctance to lose him. As a result, Sears became the first victim from whom Dahmer retained preserved body parts for an extended period, including the mummified head and G. When the public came to know about this part, they were also disgusted. One of them wrote, quote, "He took the law into his own hands, which is a good thing when you consider that the police in Milwaukee did nothing for years, when people would call to complain about Jeffrey Dahmer and his horrific activities in his apartment." Another one added, "The ability of him to openly talk about his obsession and thought process has helped doctors understand the psyche of serial Ks. Dr. Park Dietz admired this guy for his honesty, and that's about the only thing Jeffrey did right in life. I'm so sorry for the victims and their family." During his trial for Child M in May 1989, Dahmer presented himself as remorseful and repentant, eloquently arguing in his own defense that he had recognized the errors of his way, framing his arrest as a pivotal moment in his life. His defense counsel advocated for treatment rather than incarceration, a plea that the judge accepted. Dahmer received a 1-year prison sentence on day release, allowing him to work during the day and return to prison at night, along with a 5-year probationary sentence. In a later interview with CNN, Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, revealed that he wrote a letter to the court requesting psychological help for his son before his parole. Despite this plea, Dahmer was granted an early release by the judge, having served only 10 months of his sentence. After a brief period living with his grandmother post-release, during which there is no apparent increase in his body count, Dahmer returned to his own apartment.
His mother didn't know, I didn't know, and apparently none of his playmates knew.
Over the subsequent 2 years, Dahmer escalated his horrifying spree, claiming the lives of 12 more victims, bringing the total to 17. His first victim during this period was Raymond Smith, a prostitute whom Dahmer enticed to his apartment for S. After offering a drink laced with sleeping tablets, Dahmer strangled him, took suggestive photos of his body, and then proceeded to dismember him. In the case of Edward Smith, Dahmer accidentally destroyed his skull while attempting to dry it in the oven, causing it to explode. Dahmer later expressed remorse, stating that he felt rotten about Smith's murder because he couldn't preserve anything from his body, making it seem like a true waste. As Dahmer continued his K spree, he developed rituals, experimenting with chemical methods of disposal and even consuming the flesh of his victims. Engaging in crude lobotomies, he drilled into the skull of his 11th victim, Errol Lindsay, while still alive, and injected him with muriatic acid. Dahmer hoped this would render Lindsay permanently submissive, but Lindsay regained consciousness during the procedure, asking about the time with the headache. In response, Dahmer strangled him. Dahmer K'd 4 more men before he was finally arrested. One of his last victims was Oliver Lacey, 24, whose body Dahmer had S with before dismembering the corpse. He kept Lacey's head and heart in his refrigerator and his skeleton in a freezer. Dahmer faced trial in January 1992. The same year, Scarver became incarcerated at Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. From the outset, Scarver made a conscious decision to maintain a safe distance from the notorious serial K. In an interview, Chris revealed that he never engaged with Dahmer directly but observed him from afar. Scarver developed a strong aversion to Dahmer, perceiving that he had crossed boundaries with fellow prisoners and prison staff. Dahmer's disturbing antics included shaping prison food to resemble severed limbs, a display that taunted other inmates. Scarver, unaware of Dahmer's status as a serial killer, initially grew to despise him over time. The revelation of Dahmer's heinous crimes in Wisconsin further intensified Scarver's feelings toward him. On November 28, 1994, during a prison cleaning assignment, correction officers left Scarver, Dahmer, and Jesse Anderson unattended in the bathrooms. Scarver had a news article detailing Dahmer's gruesome crimes in his pocket, describing the murders, dismemberment, and consumption of 17 men and boys from 78 to 91. While filling a bucket with his mop, Scarver felt a poke in his back. When he turned around, he noticed Dahmer and Jesse stifling laughter. Unable to identify the culprit, Scarver continued his duties. Later, he followed Dahmer into a staff locker room, brandishing a 20-inch, 5-pound metal bar, and confronting him with the newspaper article. Expressing his deep disgust, Scarver questioned Dahmer about his heinous actions. Despite Dahmer's attempts to leave, Scarver blocked his way and delivered a fatal beating with the metal bar. News sources reported Scarver leaving Dahmer on the ground, gurgling as his skull collapsed from the severe blows. Post-mortem reports revealed Dahmer's head was unrecognizable due to the extensive injuries resulting in his death. Scarver then proceeded to a locker room where Anderson was working, and he subjected him to a similar fatal beating. Although officially deemed an accident by some, Scarver believes it was no coincidence that he ended up alone with Dahmer. He contends that prison officials, aware of his strong animosity towards Dahmer, deliberately orchestrated the situation to ensure Dahmer's demise. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer suffered a fate reminiscent of the horrors he inflicted on his own victims. In 2015, Christopher Scarver revealed to the New York Post his motivation for K-ing Jeffrey Dahmer. Scarver said his reason to K Dahmer was because his eyes seemed unrepentant about the crimes he had committed, some of which included dismembering and eating people. Scarver said, quote, "He crossed the line with some people, prisoners, prison staff. Some people who are in prison are repentant, but Dahmer was not one of them." He claimed Dahmer would use ketchup packets to mimic blood and would mold prison food into the shape of body parts to play up to his Milwaukee Cannibal nickname. Scarver's claims were backed up by the prison pastor, Roy Ratcliffe, who said Dahmer had a Cannibals Anonymous meeting poster in his cell. However, this claim was debunked after Dahmer's lawyer, Gerald Boyle, said taunting wasn't Dahmer's style. Boyle said, quote, "He K'd people, but he didn't taunt people. I never saw him do anything that would lead me to believe that he would mimic the deaths that he caused. I just don't believe that." Since then, he has been the focus of various TV and film projects, including the 2002 biographical film Dahmer starring Jeffrey Renner, the 2017 film My Friend Dahmer starring Ross Lynch, and most recently the TV series Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story starring Evan Peters.